We want peace all across the Middle East. Free, free Syria! 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 Free, free Gaza! Free, free Gaza! Free, free Syria! Free, free Syria! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine!
I'll be speaking with Ann Eveleth. She hails from Detroit, lives in Washington, D.C., has been an activist for decades, and has worked as a journalist. She helped work with the Landless Peoples Movement in post-apartheid South Africa and helped build the Syria Solidarity International. Now working on the anti-war committees in solidarity with struggles for self-determination. And she helped organize the walkout of the Ajamu Baraka speech at the Left Forum. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Stanley. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So, what are some of your impressions of the Left Forum? I know mostly you did work around Syria this weekend.
Well, it's I think the third time that I've been to the Left Forum. The last time was a few years ago. I can't remember the exact year, but the prevailing impression I had of the forum overall was that it was relatively poorly attended this year. It actually took them 45 minutes to fill up, 75% of the hall for the closing plenary, among other things, but it wasn't very crowded. And secondly, what was very notable was that, unlike in previous years where there's been diverse participants and in both background and age groups, this year it was predominantly older white activists and especially predominantly older white men. So it seems to have lost its appeal to wider groups of the population, to people of color, and to the youth.
Mm-hmm. And it seems to have had this problem with some of its plenaries of giving an opportunity for Assad apologists, for want of a better term, to speak to their large gatherings.
Absolutely. In fact, the forum's schedule, if one looked through all the panels, and I really only had time to glance through them, was, really smattered with, had quite a smattering of actively pro-Assadist panels, and then also kind of panels typical of the corroded thinking of this segment of the so-called left, or what I call the alt-imperialist unleft, which is to latch onto every conspiracy they can find. I would say this is kind of best typified by the fact that they featured a panel on chemtrails.
Amazing. So you helped organize this walkout. What were some of your reasons for that?
Well, in fact, our motivation to really organize a substantive intervention into the Left Forum itself was, as Syria solidarity activists, we've, constantly, obviously, been struggling against the elements of the left, and particularly those that dominate the remnants of the anti-war movement that, much wider forces helped to build up in opposition to the Iraq War. So these forces frequently dominate left spaces. This year we actually got tipped off to how prominent that would be by learning that Ajamu Baraka, who is a noted Assadist and was the vice presidential candidate of the Green Party, and immediately came out with defenses of, Assad being democratically elected by 99% of the people, and mocking. I think the figure is something different, but nevertheless, this idea that, when a dictator holds an election and, there's no one else to vote for. They are therefore democratically elected, was something that Ajamu Baraka was very eager and vocal in defending. And so when he turned up as a featured speaker by the forum, we thought, well, it really was important for us to carve out a space to make sure that the other side, the side of the Syrian revolution, had a presence in the forum.
And we talked about the physical aspects of what happened with Robert Coffey, and it's pretty impressive. A decent number of people, and then we have some video of you all outside after the walkout with the various signs and so on, and chanting. And I don't know if that was ever done at a left forum before, but it certainly shows them, sends them a message.
Yes, I do hope and believe that we did send them a message. I think there probably have been other protests at the Left Forum before, but I've never seen one that was organized really to protest the decisions of the forum to feature unacceptable speakers. I was very pleased with both the turnout of people who had tickets and were participating inside the forum, and our other allies from the broader Forces of Syria Solidarity in New York City, who were able to come and support us from the outside. Yes, I think that we did set the cat amongst the pigeons. If one looks at some of the responses that we've seen on social media following our protest, the so-called Black Peace Alliance, which is really just seems to just be a fan club for Ajamu Baraka, immediately came out with some rather humorous responses, calling us all left latte imperialists, etc. Which, my response is I would rather be called a left latte imperialist than, find myself standing on the side of a 47-year dictatorship, which is engaged in an active genocide against an actually existing revolution that was initiated by the working class and the peasantry of Syria.
How did you first
very much.
I'm sorry. How did you first get interested in the Syrian revolution? Let's say.
Well, I was first interested in the Arab Spring, actually. I had just returned from living overseas for 16 years. I'd been in the UK for a couple of years and South Africa for a long time after that, and I came back in 2007 into the headwinds of the recession. And was really, coming from an activist milieu in South Africa, where I'd been involved in social movements, I came back into a country where I saw a left largely in disarray and absolutely unable to stand up in a cohesive way against the banks and against, what was really happening economically in this country and around the world, was rather frustrated with that. And then 2011 came along, and Tahrir Square was just the most inspiring moment that I had seen, in many, many, many years. And obviously, it opened the door to a prospect for, very substantive grassroots-led, bottom-up change throughout the Middle East, which would have an impact throughout the world. And we did immediately see that impact back here in the U.S. with the beginning of Occupy, for all of its strengths and weaknesses. I would never hold it up as having been a perfect response, but it did show that Americans were inspired by the bravery of the activists of Tahrir Square and Tunisia before that, and Libya and Syria, and all the countries across the region where people rose to try to oust dictatorships, regardless of who they were sponsored by, and claim democracy and dignity and freedom and self-determination in their own countries. So my inspiration started then. It started with Tahrir Square. And when the people of Syria also rose, obviously everyone knew that they were going to have a difficult time facing the Assad regime, which had been brutal for a very long time. But nobody expected the incredible level of brutality or that it would continue until now. Nor did we expect, probably we should have, but nor did we expect the brutal response from elements of not only the U.S. pseudo-left, but also, the pseudo-left from Europe and other places around the world, who would be able to convince themselves and actually go out speaking about Syrians as mere stooges of the CIA, without consideration for the question of whether millions and millions of people could actually be inspired to risk and lose their lives, to go into exile, to live in refugee camps, to lose their entire country, future, and really put everything on the line for this many years on behalf of the CIA.
Really incredible. A lot of
it's incredibly cynical.
A lot of our heroes from the fight against the Iraq War just blindly seeing everything in the world as a CIA plot.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that it's, of course we have many debates even within the anti-Assad left, which, just to add, after it became apparent that so much of the left was against them, it forced those of us who did see the importance of the Syrian revolution to really get organized specifically around support to Syria. It could no longer just be about the Arab Spring broadly, but we actually did need to speak directly to the question of Syria and really fight against these forces. Yes, I think that we've had many debates that have tried to figure out where and when the rot set in to much of what calls itself the left. We say in the West, but I also know of, Assadist factions within South Africa, and I'm sure, and in Latin America, and so I'm sure everywhere in the world we have this problem right now.
Mm-hmm.
But trying to dig back to, where did it all start? Where did it all go wrong? Is a debate. It's a debatable question. But what is not debatable is that anyone who is approaching the Syrian revolution as something that is, inspired and upheld and just kept going, not by the people themselves, but by the CIA and imperialist objectives, seems to have very little grasp on what imperialism actually is. Imperialism is a system which organizes power relations between states in the world. It is not a destination. It's not a euphemism for the United States. We can't alternate the word imperialism and the name of the United States and just leave it at that. Other powers can be and are imperialist. Russia is a decisively imperialist power in the world right now. So is China. And there are regional imperialist powers like Saudi Arabia and Iran. South Africa is an imperialist power in its own region. There are imperialist actors in many places in the world. Their reach and their domain, may be geographically specific, but this behavior is not specific to the United States. And as long as we, narrow it down just to the United States, well, it's a very easy proposition to take as a leftist. You just say, well, I don't really have to try to understand anything else in the world. I don't have to go beyond Orientalist, notions that all Muslims are jihadists or, any other kind of racist notions about, Africans or Latinos or any other groups in the world. I can just stick with those kind of discriminatory tropes. And keep my focus on my own country, my own backyard, and say, the only responsibility I have is to stand up against the United States and anyone around the world who doesn't fit into my little box, my own narcissistic concern. They are the enemy, right? And now so,
Mm-hmm. Right. Now you talked at several of the panels on Syria. And in one of them, you brought up something going on in, I believe, October, an attempt for a march on the Pentagon, and you were worried about it. Could you elaborate?
Yes. So I think one of the things that those of us on the principled left need to keep focusing on is how we prevent the rot of Assadism from seeping into every organizing space within the left and the broader progressive society that we have. So the anti-war movement in general has largely become dominated by these people. And yet we have also the resistance to Trump that's been rising and the rising women's movement. And we need to make sure that these people don't infect all of these spaces with this kind of corrupt politics that supports and applauds genocide. So something that's been worrying me a lot lately is that a known Assadist, Cindy Sheehan, who gained a lot of space through the Iraq anti-war movement, has decided to call a women's march on the Pentagon for October this year to coincide with the anniversary of the Women's March on the Pentagon during the Vietnam War. And I believe that through doing this, she's trying to both assert, further the Assadist line within and the unipolar world view of the corrupt anti-war movement within the women's section of the anti-war movement, but also to assert it over the growing women's movement at large. And I believe that we need to organize ourselves to ensure that the voices of other women throughout the country, immigrants from all over, from Syria, from Iran, from Egypt, from Yemen, from Mexico, from everywhere in the world that is faced not only with U.S. imperialism, but also the complexity of imperialism as a global system, that these voices, that these women immigrants' voices are actually heard in this march. And so I think that, that is the task before us to make sure that these people are not able to, both finally assert themselves over the anti-war movement, but also hijack the women's movement.
Well, I want to thank you very much for talking with me today.
Thank you very much, Stanley.